Picture this. It's 3 in the morning, January 1892, northern Wisconsin. The temperature is 26 degrees below zero, and you're standing on a frozen lake watching something that shouldn't be possible. A train of sleighs is moving across the ice. Not a small load, not a reasonable load. 200 tons of white pine stacked 15 feet high, pulled by a team of horses whose breath freezes into clouds the moment it leaves their nostrils. The ice beneath them groans, it cracks, it sings in that eerie way that frozen water does when weight presses down on it, and nobody runs. Because this is Tuesday. This is the job. Before there were highways, before there were railroads reaching every timber stand, before diesel engines and hydraulic loaders, American loggers solved an impossible problem with ice, water, and sheer audacity. They turned frozen lakes and rivers into highways. They moved entire forests across landscapes that would swallow a wagon in mud come springtime, and they did it in the dark. This is the story of the ice roads, the sprinkler sleds that built them, the road monkeys who maintained them through the coldest nights of the year, the Teamsters who drove loads so heavy that a single miscalculation meant death, and the forgotten engineering marvel that made the American lumber industry possible during the 6 decades when this nation was building itself out of wood. You've seen the photographs, the iconic images of the logging era, massive loads of timber dwarfing the men who cut them, horses that look impossibly small beneath mountains of logs. What you probably didn't know is that nearly all of those photographs were taken in winter, on ice roads, because that was the only time you could move loads like that. The frozen months weren't a break from logging. They were the whole point. Let me take you back to the beginning. To understand why men would risk their lives hauling timber across frozen lakes at night, you need to understand what they were up against the rest of the year. The great pine forests of the upper Midwest sat on some of the worst terrain imaginable for moving heavy loads. We're talking swamps, bogs. Ground so saturated with water that a loaded wagon would sink to its axles in minutes. Rivers that flooded unpredictably. Mud that could swallow a horse. A single white pine log from a mature tree could weigh 4,000 pounds. A good day's cutting from a skilled crew might produce 50,000 board feet of lumber. That's not counting the branches, the tops, the slash, just the merchantable timber, and all of it had to move from the cutting site to the river, where it could float downstream to the sawmills. In summer, this was nearly impossible. Even the best corduroy roads, those brutal constructions of logs laid crosswise in the mud, could only handle so much weight. A team of horses pulling a loaded wagon on bare ground needed to exert enormous force just to overcome friction. The wheels sank, the horses strained. Progress was measured in yards per hour. Then winter came, and everything changed. The physics of ice are remarkable when you understand them. When water freezes into a smooth, hard surface, the coefficient of friction drops dramatically. A load that requires tremendous force to move on dirt or gravel suddenly glides. I sent the same team of horses that struggled to pull 2 tons on a summer road could move 20 tons on ice. Sometimes more. The numbers here are worth pausing on. On bare ground, a team of horses pulling a loaded sledge has to overcome substantial resistance. Friction, soil deformation, wheel sinkage. Call it 100 pounds of pulling force required for every ton of load. That adds up fast. On ice, that same resistance drops by 90%. 90%. The same horses, the same harness, the same driver. 10 times the load. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a transformation of what's physically possible. But wild ice wasn't enough. Natural lake ice is uneven. It has pressure ridges, cracks, thin spots where springs bubble up from below. Snow accumulates on top, adding drag and hiding dangers. To truly exploit the physics of ice, you needed something better than nature provided. You needed an ice road. The technology seems almost absurdly simple when you first hear about it. A sprinkler sled? That's it. A wooden tank mounted on runners, filled with water, with holes or a spray bar at the rear. A team of horses pulls it along the route, and water streams out behind, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. Simple in concept, revolutionary in practice. The sprinkler sled itself was a piece of rough engineering genius. Picture a wooden tank, maybe 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, sitting on heavy oak runners. The tank held 200 to 300 gallons of water. At the rear, a series of holes or a perforated pipe let the water escape in a controlled spray. The key was the spray pattern. Too concentrated, and you'd get a ridge of ice down the center of the road, too diffuse, and the water would spread too thin to build up proper thickness. The men who operated these sleds adjusted their spray patterns by partially plugging holes with wooden pegs or by modifying the angle of the spray bar. Trial and error, season after season, until they knew exactly how to lay down ice. The men who built ice roads understood something that we've largely forgotten. They understood that infrastructure isn't just about the path, it's about the surface. They were building roads the way a modern engineer builds a highway, thinking about load distribution, friction coefficients, drainage, and grade. They just happened to be doing it with water and cold air instead of asphalt and concrete. The process started in late fall, before the heavy snows. And crews would scout and clear the route, removing stumps and boulders, filling holes, grading the worst slopes. This was brutal work done in increasingly cold weather, and it was just the preparation. Once temperatures dropped reliably below zero, usually by late November, the sprinkler sleds came out. The first passes laid down a base layer of ice on the packed snow, then another pass, and another, each layer adding thickness, smoothness, strength. A well-built ice road might have 6 inches of solid ice on its surface by the time it was ready for use. That ice could support loads that would crack pavement today. But building the road was only the beginning. Maintaining it was the real challenge. And that's where the road monkeys came in. Road monkey. It sounds almost playful. The reality was anything but. These were boys mostly. Teenagers, sometimes younger. Their job was to patrol the ice roads at night, every night, for the entire hauling season. They carried tools for chipping away rough spots. They spread hay or sand on hills to provide braking traction for the morning's loads. And they operated the sprinkler sleds, laying down fresh ice to repair the damage from each day's hauling. This work happened exclusively after dark. There was a reason for that. Daytime temperatures, even in the depths of a Wisconsin winter, could climb above freezing when the sun hit the ice. Morning loads needed to move before that warming began, which meant the repairs had to happen at night. Picture yourself as one of these boys. You're 14 years old. It's 2 in the morning. The temperature is 30 below. You're walking beside a sprinkler sled, watching for problems. So I'm adjusting the spray, making sure the water is flowing evenly. Your feet are wrapped in layers of wool and leather, but the cold finds its way through anyway. Your hands ache. Your face is numb. You can feel the ice forming in your eyebrows, in your beard if you're old enough to have one, and you'll do this for another 4 hours. Then sleep in a bunkhouse that barely keeps out the cold. Then do it again tomorrow night, and the night after, until spring breaks the roads apart and the season ends. Road monkeys earned $15 to $20 a month. Some of them were orphans. Some were farm boys looking to escape brutal home situations. Some were just desperate for any work at all in an economy that offered few options for the young and unskilled. The lumber companies called them road monkeys because they scrambled over the ice roads like monkeys over branches. The boys themselves had other names for the work, most of which couldn't be printed in the newspapers of the day. By dawn, the roads were ready. Fresh ice gleamed in the early light, and the Teamsters took over. A Teamster in the ice road logging era was part driver, part engineer, part daredevil. These were not men who simply pointed horses in a direction and let them walk. They were managing complex systems of animal power, load distribution, and environmental hazard, often with their own lives riding on every decision. The horses themselves were specialists. Woods horses, they were called. Massive draft animals bred for strength and cold tolerance. Percherons, Belgians, Clydesdales. And some teams weighed over 4,000 pounds combined, and they needed every ounce of that muscle. Their shoes were fitted with calks, steel spikes that bit into the ice, providing traction where smooth steel would slip. Getting those shoes right was an art. Too sharp, and the horse might crack the ice surface. Too dull, and it couldn't pull. Farriers who specialized in winter logging work were paid premium wages and treated with respect bordering on reverence. The caulks themselves were about 3/8 of an inch long, made of hardened steel, set into the horseshoe at precise angles. A good set of caulk shoes might last 3 weeks of heavy work before needing replacement. In a busy season, a farrier might shoe the same horse 8 or 10 times. A typical load started modestly, 20 tons, 30 tons. Logs stacked on massive sleighs with runners that might be 12 feet long and 8 inches wide, spreading the weight across as much ice surface as possible. The loads were chained down, checked, double-checked. Once that sleigh started moving, you couldn't stop it quickly. Then the competitive streak of the logging camps took over. Every camp wanted to claim the biggest load. Every teamster wanted to be known as the man who moved the impossible. And the loads grew. 40 tons, 60, 80. By the 1890s, the record loads were entering territory that seems like mythology. 100 tons, 150. Finally, in the winter of 1893, a sleigh train in Michigan hauled over 200 tons of timber in a single trip. 36,000 board feet of lumber, enough wood to build several houses, moving across ice behind a team of horses. The photograph of that load still exists. The horses look like toys next to it. The men standing beside it for scale are barely visible. And somewhere beneath them, ice is holding all of that weight, groaning, but not breaking. How did the ice hold? This is where the engineering becomes genuinely impressive. The men who built ice roads didn't have physics degrees. They had experience, generations of accumulated knowledge about how ice behaves under load. They knew that ice is stronger than you'd expect if you treat it right, and they knew exactly how to treat it right. First, thickness. An ice road builder could estimate the safe load capacity of ice by its thickness with remarkable accuracy. 4 inches of clear ice could support a man on foot. 8 inches could handle a horse and light sleigh. 12 inches would carry a loaded logging sleigh. Anything over 15 inches was considered virtually unlimited for the loads of the day, but thickness wasn't everything. The ice had to be solid, clear, free of air bubbles and the white porous ice that forms when snow gets incorporated into the freeze. Clear ice is dramatically stronger than cloudy ice of the same thickness. The difference isn't small. Clear ice might support twice the load of white ice of identical thickness. The sprinkler sled system produced exactly this kind of ice. Because the water was applied in thin layers and froze quickly in the cold air, it created dense, clear ice with almost no air inclusions. This artificial ice was actually stronger than the natural lake ice beneath it. Then there was load distribution. The long runners on logging sleighs spread weight across many square feet of ice surface. Multiple sleighs in a train were spaced carefully, ensuring that the load never concentrated in one spot. Speed was kept low because dynamic forces from movement could crack ice that would easily support a static load, and timing mattered enormously. Early morning, before the sun could warm the surface. Coldest part of the night for the heaviest loads. Never during a thaw, never when rain threatened. The Teamsters watched the weather with the intensity of sea captains watching for storms. Still, the ice broke sometimes, and when it did, the results were catastrophic. The worst ice road disasters often happened in spring, during the frantic final weeks of hauling season. Every logging camp knew that their window was closing. Warm weather was coming. The roads would soften, then fail, and all that timber still stacked at the cutting sites would be stranded until next winter. So they pushed. They ran loads in conditions they shouldn't have. They trusted ice that was showing signs of weakness. They hoped. Hope is not an engineering principle. The signs of spring breakup were subtle at first, a slight softening of the surface ice during afternoon hours, water pooling on top of the road instead of freezing instantly. The ice itself developing a grayish tinge as microscopic cracks filled with meltwater. Experienced Teamsters could read these signs like a language. They knew when a road was failing. The problem was that not everyone listened to the experienced Teamsters. Camp foremen had quotas. Timber was stacked. There was money to be made or lost. And so the loads kept running, even when the ice was telling anyone who listened that time had run out. In March of 1887, a sleigh train broke through on Big Spider Lake in northern Wisconsin. The ice had seemed solid. It had held loads all winter, but a warm spell had weakened a section over a spring, and nobody knew. The lead horses went through first, then the sleigh, then the second team, pulled forward by the momentum of the train and the chains connecting the loads. 4 horses drowned before the teamster could cut them free. The timber, thousands of board feet of white pine, sank to the bottom of the lake. The teamster survived by jumping clear and scrambling across ice that cracked beneath him with every step. He made it to shore with frostbitten hands and feet that would trouble him for the rest of his life. His name was Lars Henriksen. He was 23 years old. He went back to work the next week because that was the job and there was no other option. Stories like Lars Henriksen's were common enough that they barely made the newspapers. A few horses drowned, a load was lost, a man had a close call. These weren't tragedies by the standards of the logging industry. They were Tuesdays. The real tragedies were bigger. Whole trains going through, men trapped under the loads, horses screaming as they tried to scramble out of water that was already freezing around them. In the winter of 1901, a night-hauling operation on Lake Gagabish in Michigan went wrong in ways that still haunt the local memory. A sprinkler sled had passed over a section of ice weakened by a pressure ridge just hours before. The water from the sprinkler had seeped into cracks that nobody could see in the dark. When the morning's first loaded sleigh crossed that section, the ice shattered. 3 Teamsters went into the water. 2 of them were never recovered. Their names were Michael Corrigan and Johannes Weber, immigrants who had come to America looking for work and found it in the frozen darkness of the Michigan timber country. The ice closed over them within minutes. By the time rescue attempts could be organized, there was nothing to rescue. The lake kept their bodies until spring, when they washed up on the southern shore, still wearing their heavy winter clothes. Michael Corrigan had a wife and 2 children in Marquette. Johannes Weber had been sending money back to family in Germany. Neither family received death benefits. Neither family received much of anything except word that their husband, their father, their son was gone. This was the cost of the timber that built American cities. This was the price paid for the lumber that framed houses in Chicago and Milwaukee and Detroit. Not in dollars per board foot, but in names, in families destroyed, in bodies never recovered from frozen lakes. And yet the work continued because the wood was needed, because the jobs were needed, because there was no other way. Let me walk you through a typical day on the ice roads, not the disasters, just the routine, because the routine itself was remarkable enough. The Teamsters rose before dawn, usually around 4 in the morning. Breakfast in the camp cookhouse was massive. Flapjacks, bacon, beans, coffee strong enough to strip paint. These men would burn 4,000 calories or more before the day was done, and they needed every one of them. The horses were already being prepared by the stable crew, harnesses checked, caulk shoes inspected, feed bags filled for the midday break. A logging horse might eat 30 pounds of hay and 15 pounds of oats per day during the hauling season. They worked as hard as the men, and they needed fuel to match. By 5:30, the first loads were moving. In the winter darkness, lanterns hung from the sleighs cast pools of yellow light on the gleaming ice. The horses' breath steamed. The runners sang against the frozen surface, a high, keening sound that carried for miles in the still air. The road itself was a marvel of organization. Traffic moved in one direction in the morning, unloaded sleighs heading toward the river or rail landing. The route was marked with stakes and reflectors. Turnouts were built at regular intervals where sleighs could pull aside if needed. On the hills, things got interesting. And ice roads couldn't be flat. The terrain of the Northwoods doesn't allow it. So the road builders graded the slopes as gently as possible, but some grades were unavoidable. And getting a 50-ton load down a hill on ice was a problem that required creative solutions. The hay spreader was one answer. A man with a wagon loaded with hay or sand would precede the loaded sleighs, spreading material on the ice to provide friction for braking. The horses could dig their caulked shoes into this material. The sleigh runners would grip instead of sliding free. On the steepest grades, chains were wrapped around the runners to act as brakes. Sometimes logs were dragged behind the sleigh, their friction slowing the descent. and sometimes a man would simply walk ahead, watching the load, ready to shout a warning if things started to go wrong. Going wrong on a downgrade meant runaway. A 50-ton sleigh building speed on ice has no brakes that can stop it. The horses would be running flat out just to stay ahead of the load pushing them from behind. If they fell, if they stumbled, if they couldn't maintain the pace, the sleigh would roll right over them. Teamsters told stories about runaways the way sailors tell stories about storms. The loads that came off the hills so fast, the horses were nearly flying. The sleighs that jumped the road and crashed into the timber. The men who rode runaway loads to the bottom through luck or skill or divine intervention. Carl Magnusson was legendary in the camps around Rhinelander for a runaway he survived in the winter of 1889. His load broke free on a grade called Devil's Elbow, a quarter-mile descent that dropped 120 feet. The hay spread that morning had been too thin. The horses started running. Carl stayed on the load. He couldn't jump, he said later, because there was nowhere to jump to. Trees on both sides, ice below, 50 tons of logs behind him. So he rode it, shouting commands to the horses, trying to keep them running straight, praying the road would hold. It held. The horses kept their feet. The sleigh stayed on the road. At the bottom, where the grade leveled out, Carl managed to slow the team and finally stop. The horses were lathered despite the cold. Carl himself was shaking so badly he couldn't climb down from the sleigh for 10 minutes. He went back to work the next day. That was the job. By midday, the first loads had reached the landing. This might be a riverbank where the timber would wait for spring drive. It might be a railroad siding where the logs would be loaded onto flat cars. Either way, the landing was a scene of organized chaos. Logs were rolled off the sleighs using peavies and cant hooks, those elegant tools that turned human muscle into leverage. The timber was stacked, scaled, and recorded. Every board foot was accounted for. Every log was marked with the company's stamp. The empty sleighs turned around and headed back to the cutting sites. This return trip was faster, lighter, or was almost relaxed compared to the morning's tension. The Teamsters might stop for coffee at one of the warming shanties along the route, rough buildings with stoves where men could thaw out for a few minutes. By mid-afternoon, the second loads were moving, and by dark, the day's hauling was done. The Teamsters would return to camp, care for their horses, eat an enormous supper, and collapse into their bunks. Meanwhile, the road monkeys were just starting their shift. The sprinkler sled went out after full dark. The route that had been churned by a day's traffic needed repair. Ruts from the runners had to be filled. Rough spots had to be smoothed. The entire surface needed a fresh coat of water to freeze overnight. The sled held perhaps 300 gallons of water drawn from a hole kept open in the lake ice for exactly this purpose. And keeping that hole open was itself a daily chore. Ice would try to reclaim it constantly, and men would chop it clear every few hours. The water was warm relative to the air. It came from the lake at 32 degrees, and it hit air that might be 20 or 30 below. The freezing was almost instantaneous. You could watch the spray turn from liquid to solid before it hit the ground. If you were standing close, you could hear it too. A soft crackling, like distant fire as the water crystallized into ice. The smell of an ice road operation was distinctive. Horse sweat and harness leather, pine resin from fresh-cut logs, wood smoke from the warming shanties, and underneath it all, that particular clean scent of deep cold, like the air itself had been frozen pure. Multiple passes were often needed. The road monkey, walking alongside the sled, would check the ice with a stick or his boot, looking for thin spots, rough patches, any imperfection that might catch a runner in the morning. He would note problems for the crew to address. He would spread hay on the grades. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the work was done. The road monkey might get a few hours of sleep before the day shift began again, or he might be called out for emergency repairs if the temperature rose unexpectedly or something else went wrong. This cycle continued from late November until March. Every day, every night, Sundays included, Christmas included, in conditions that ranged from merely cold to actively lethal. The men adapted in ways that seem almost superhuman today. They learned to function in cold that would send a modern person into hypothermia. They developed instincts for ice that bordered on prescient. They became part of a system so finely tuned that it could move millions of board feet of lumber in a single season. And they did it knowing that every trip across the ice might be their last. The economics of ice road logging were brutal in their clarity. A camp needed to move its timber during the frozen months or face ruin. The investment in cutting, in buildings, in horses and equipment, all of it depended on getting the logs to market. Summer logging was possible in some areas, on high ground with decent roads, but the great pine forests often sat in the worst terrain. Swamps and bogs that were impassable without frost. Rivers too small to float logs until spring melt. Winter was the only option. Ice roads made winter possible. Of course, the payoff was enormous for the lumber companies. A well-managed ice road operation could move timber at a fraction of the cost of summer hauling. The efficiency gains were staggering. The same horses that struggled with 2 tons on dirt could handle 20 tons on ice, 10 times the productivity with the same equipment. For the workers, the calculation was different. They earned steady wages during months when other work was scarce. $30 to $50 per month for Teamsters, plus room and board, less for the road monkeys and general laborers. It was enough to survive, enough to send money home, enough to get through to spring. But steady wages came with steady risk. Every man in a logging camp knew someone who had been killed or maimed. Falls, drowning, runaway loads, trees that fell the wrong direction, 100 ways to die in the woods. The ice roads were just one more entry on that list. There was no insurance, no workers' compensation, no safety inspectors to investigate accidents and assign blame. If you were hurt, you might get care in the camp, such as it was. If you were killed, your family might receive your last month's wages if the company was feeling generous. Most companies were not feeling generous. The lumber barons of the Gilded Age viewed their workers as replaceable components. There was always another immigrant willing to take the job. Always another farm boy desperate enough to work in conditions that would kill him. The supply of labor seemed infinite, and the companies treated it accordingly. This was the deal. Everyone understood it. Work hard, get paid, don't complain, don't die if you can help it. If you died anyway, well, someone else would take your place tomorrow. The ice roads reached their peak in the 1890s. This was the golden age, if you can call it that, of winter logging in the lake states. The great white pine forests were being cut at a pace that would strip them bare within a generation, and the ice roads carried that timber to market. Camps competed for records. The biggest load, the longest haul, the most timber moved in a single season. These records were a matter of fierce local pride, reported in newspapers, argued about in bars, remembered for decades after the men who set them had died. The record loads grew to absurd proportions. 100 tons became routine. 150 was considered excellent. 200 tons was the stuff of legend. And then the forests began to fail. It happened gradually at first. The big trees near the rivers were cut first, because they were easiest to move. Then the camps pushed farther into the wilderness, roads growing longer, costs rising. Then the farther stands were cut. Then there was nothing left but scrub and second growth. By 1900, the great white pine forests of Wisconsin and Michigan were largely gone. The industry that had built fortunes and killed hundreds of men was moving west, to the Douglas fir and redwoods of the Pacific coast, to trees so massive that even the ice road methods couldn't handle them. The ice roads didn't disappear entirely. They continued in remote areas where timber operations still made sense. They evolved to carry supplies to mining camps and isolated communities. The techniques developed for logging found new applications. But the great era was over. The photographs that remain, those iconic images of impossible loads and tiny horses, are memorials to a time and a technology that passed almost as completely as the forest they served. What remains is the memory, and the question of what we owe to the men who did this work. I've walked the shores of lakes where ice roads once ran. Big Spider Lake, Lake Gaugabek, the chains of lakes in northern Wisconsin, where sleigh trains move millions of board feet. The water is clear and cold. The forests have grown back, second growth and third, nothing like the ancient pines that once stood here. Sometimes, on the bottom, you can still find logs, timber that slipped off sleighs and sank before anyone could retrieve it. The cold water preserves them perfectly. A diver in Lake Gogbik reported finding white pine logs on the bottom that looked fresh cut, still showing the marks of the axes that felled them. They had been there for over a century. Those logs are monuments, unintentional, unmarked, but monuments nonetheless. They mark the places where men like Michael Corrigan and Johannes Weber gave their lives for lumber that built American cities. They mark the crossing points of ice roads that made the impossible routine. The men who built and worked these roads had no illusions about what they were doing. They knew the timber wouldn't last forever. They knew the work was dangerous. They knew the companies viewed them as disposable. They did it anyway, because the work was there, because their families needed money, because the alternative was something even worse. We build our mythology around the wrong figures sometimes. The lumber barons get statues, the industrialists get museums, the company founders get their names on universities and hospitals, monuments to philanthropy funded by profits wrung from frozen lakes and dead men. The Teamsters get nothing. The road monkeys get nothing. The men who drowned when the ice gave way get, at best, a name in a forgotten newspaper article, a line in a company ledger, a grave marker if they were lucky enough to have a body recovered. This is the debt we rarely acknowledge. Every wooden building that stood in the Midwest at the turn of the century, every frame house, every factory, every barn, that wood came from somewhere. It was cut by someone, it was moved by someone, it was moved on ice, by men who did the work because the work needed doing, who died doing it sometimes and were replaced the next day by other men just as desperate. The ice roads melted every spring. The evidence disappeared, but the lumber remained, built into the structures of American life, carrying no trace of the frozen highways that delivered it, no echo of the horse's breath or the crack of yielding ice. I think about the road monkeys especially. Those boys, 14, 15, 16 years old, out on the ice at 3 in the morning in 30 below temperatures, keeping the roads alive so the morning's loads could move. Some of them grew up to be Teamsters themselves. Some of them got out of logging and found other work. Some of them didn't make it that far. The cold, the exhaustion, the 1,000 ways the work could kill you, their names are mostly lost. The company records listed them as road crew or didn't list them at all. They were the invisible labor that made the visible achievements possible. Without them, the ice roads would have deteriorated within days. Without them, the record loads could never have moved. We don't build monuments to invisible labor. We probably should. The last of the old ice road Teamsters died decades ago. The last of the road monkeys, too. The knowledge they carried, the instincts they developed, the feel for ice and weather and horses that kept them alive, all of that died with them. What we have left are the photographs, the company records, the occasional memoir or interview recorded just before the last witnesses passed on, and the logs at the bottom of the lakes, preserved in cold water, waiting for no one. If you drive through northern Wisconsin or Michigan's Upper Peninsula today, you can still see the roots. Some of them became actual roads when the automobile age arrived. The grades are gentle because the old road builders made them that way for the sleighs. The curves are wide because loaded sleighs couldn't turn sharp. You're driving on ice roads, you just don't know it. And somewhere beneath the pavement, or beneath the lakes beside the road, are the traces of what those roads cost. The price paid in cold nights and broken bodies and names that no one remembers. The lumber industry called it progress, the building of America, the opening of the frontier, the transformation of wilderness into civilization. The men who did the work had simpler names for it. A job, a way to survive the winter, a way to send money home. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as workers, men doing what needed to be done because someone had to do it. But there was heroism in it, in going out on ice that might not hold, in spending night after night in killing cold to keep the roads alive, in climbing onto loads that might become runaways and riding them down hills that steeper men had refused. There was a heroism, and there was loss, and there was the steady accumulation of timber that became the houses and factories and cities of a growing nation. The ice roads are gone now, the technology obsolete, the forests that justified it stripped bare and slowly regrowing. Nothing remains but photographs and memories and logs at the bottom of cold northern lakes, but the wood remains too, in the oldest buildings that somehow survived. But in the structures that were built from the timber, those frozen highways carried. Every board foot of that lumber crossed the ice, every beam and plank and shingle. If those boards could speak, they would tell stories of 3 in the morning cold, of horses straining against loads that should have been impossible, of ice that held and ice that didn't, of men who made it through and men who didn't. The boards don't speak. Neither do we, mostly, about what their transportation cost. So let this be a speaking. Let this be the acknowledgement that the lumber industry rarely made, that the progress celebrated in history books rested on ice that could break at any moment, that the timber which built American cities was carried by men who understood they might die doing it. They did it anyway. That's worth remembering. The ice roads are gone, but we are still crossing them every time we enter an old building, every time we touch wood that came from the great northern forests, every time we benefit from the infrastructure that previous generations built. We are crossing ice roads that other men maintained. We are riding on loads that other men hauled. We are warm because other men froze. That's the debt. That's what the ice roads cost. That's what we owe to the road monkeys and the Teamsters and the men who went through the ice and never came back. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their work is invisible, but they built the roads, and they hauled the loads, and they gave their lives, and we are still here because of what they did in the frozen darkness of 100 winters ago. Remember them. The ice is clear, the load is heavy, the horses are waiting, the road begins.